Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast for the week of June 17th. I'm still Jim Henson, director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas. I guess I should say I'm Jim Henson, still director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas. I haven't been fired in the last week or demoted
for now
that I know of. I'm happy to be joined again by Josh Blank, who you heard weighing in already, knowing what a good joke that was.
Well, I was thinking that, don't I move up then?
Yeah, no, I know. Oh, I know what you were thinking. He's the research director for the Texas Politics Project. Today, we want to focus on the latest UT Texas Tribune poll of public opinion in the state. The Texas Tribune will be releasing results all week as you listen to this, Monday through Thursday. You can see the stories on that, which I would encourage you to read. They will all be by our friend Ross Ramsey, who hopefully will get in here before the end of the semester. And that is at texastribune.org. Then at the end of the week, Thursday afternoon, likely, maybe Friday morning, depending on how hard Josh and the graduate students work, will be all the data and stuff will be post and graphics, stuff you guys can use in your presentations and papers for other courses maybe, at the Texas Politics Project website, which is texaspolitics.utexas.edu. So today we want to talk about what the first wave of results tell us about Texas politics at the moment, with a pretty strong emphasis on the election environment that we'll also circle back at the end if we have time to some of the issues we've talked about in terms of what the legislature did in the 2019 session and how the public is now responding to it. But we start, as all political discussions seem to start, with Texas views of Donald Trump. And Donald Trump's position as the figurehead of the Republican Party has only grown stronger in Texas, I think probably much to the chagrin and if not expectations, at least wishes of Democrats both here and nationally, right?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, there's probably something in this poll for both sides. If you're, a strong supporter of the president on the one hand, I think there's numbers in here to buttress that point that he's definitely the figurehead of the party here, and he doesn't seem to be weakening. If anything, his hold on it appears to be strengthening ever so slightly.
Among Republicans.
Among Republicans, but
right.
That's right. If slowly. But there's also stuff in here where if you're a Democrat, you can look and say, no, but there's glimmers of hope that maybe Texas will be competitive this cycle, maybe. But I mean, there's a broader context here for all polling that I feel like duty-bound to point out, which is—
You're dutiful.
I am, and I like to still keep one foot in the serious, rigorous political science camp and just point out it is so early. It is such an early period in the election cycle, and it's kind of natural, I think, for us and our schedule for doing polling where, especially in a big presidential election year, we kind of get to this June poll and we both want to look back at what the legislature did and see how that positions them, which is kind of what we've been talking about the last couple of weeks, but also firmly looking ahead to the next big political story, which is already the current big political story, which is this 2020 election cycle.
Right.
Having said that, it's still super, super early. So any sort of, any polling, whether it's ours or anybody else's that you read that says, here's how Donald Trump looks against Kamala Harris, and here's how Donald Trump looks against, Joe Biden. I mean, one of the important things that I think we did in this poll to try to illuminate this, which is to say most people are not paying attention to the election at this point. Most voters don't know who the Democratic candidates or potential Democratic candidates are. So any results that we look at need to be taken within the context of the fact that it is super, super early.
Right, and that you should, and what's going to be headlined in this poll in media coverage, and rightly so, is the fact that when we ask people in Texas, would you vote to reelect Donald Trump if the election was today, or would you vote for somebody else? The split was about as even as you could get. We went down a few decimal points to make sure everything looked right and that the rounding wasn't misleading, and it's a 50-50 split.
Right, with 39% of Texas registered voters saying that they would definitely vote to reelect Donald Trump, and 43% saying that they would definitely vote for somebody else. And so, I mean, obviously there's a pretty big partisan split there. You have 86% of Democrats saying that they would definitely vote for somebody else. You have 73% of Republicans saying they would definitely vote for Donald Trump. And, and now that's the sort of thing where, if you were just kind of coming to this, you might say, oh, well, so Democrats are definitely more enthused about this. We asked tonight about enthusiasm. There's no difference in enthusiasm for 2020 election.
Between Democrats
and Republicans. Yeah. But, the other thing you could say is, well, why are, Democrats so certain they're going to vote for somebody else, whereas Republicans are a little bit less certain? And part of this is to say Democrats are making an evaluation of Donald Trump, who we know that they dislike strongly. In our last poll, 87% disapproved of the job he was doing, as opposed to 89% of Republicans who approve of the job that he's doing. And that kind of points out a little bit of the issue here. You've got 89% of Republicans giving him approval on his job, and only 73% saying that they'll definitely vote to reelect him. But part of this is also, again, the nature of the timeline. Who's he running against? I think that what you'll find is we're going to continue asking this question, probably for a little while, but as the Democratic field starts to narrow and you start to see who an actual opponent is going to be, Republican support is going to solidify once they know, even if they're, once Republican voters know who the opposition is. Because even if they don't agree with Trump 100% of the time, or they, maybe have a problem with style or whatever, it doesn't mean that they're going to vote for Bernie Sanders, for example.
And one thing to clarify on that is we said it was 50-50, and then we gave you the numbers for definitely going to vote for Trump and definitely going to vote for someone else. So we also had these medium points that said, well, I'd probably vote for Trump or I'd probably vote for someone else. The probably vote for was 11, and the for Trump and the probably vote for someone else was 7%. You add that up, and that's how you get the 50-50 split. And I think the difficulty in interpreting this, you kind of allude to, is that you look at Trump's job approval, and it's, on the high end of the band that we've seen him in Texas. He's 52 positive approval, 44 negative, only 5 didn't, said they didn't have an opinion. And that's up a few points. He's been mostly in the high 40s. I think he's hit over 50 maybe once or twice. I'm not sure, but 52 is definitely in the high end of where he's been fluctuating. And you'll also notice if you look at national polling, if you watch the news, that's a little higher than his national level as well, which we would expect here. But for Democrats, it's not, he's not, basically creaming the unnamed Democratic opponent. So you're going to see a lot of people interested in this as well. One of the other things that we saw that was interesting in this on the Democratic side is that we polled in the Democratic primary race. A lot of interest in the native son, Beto O'Rourke, right now, but Beto was running behind the guy who's having a moment because he's more nationally well known and he's taking up a lot of media oxygen, former President Joe Biden, or former Vice President Joe Biden. Yeah,
and this comes back to, look, as this campaign cycle plays out, it may turn out that Biden is the front runner for forever. Yeah, sure.
Probably not.
I don't want to say I was about to say for a reason, but I realize he's a front runner for a reason right now. And the reason right now is the fact that he has the highest name identification of any of the Democrats. What I mean by that is when you ask people, there's a couple ways you can do this. In our poll, what we basically said was, because there's so many, there's a couple of reasons we did this. Traditionally, what you'll do is you'll say, do you have a favorable or unfavorable opinion of, and then fill in the blank, Joe Biden, Beto O'Rourke, Julian Castro, so on and so forth. And that, and then people can basically decide whether they, again, have a positive or negative opinion. They can also say, I don't have an opinion, or I'm neutral. And this is a way to kind of figure out, do people know who this person is? Can they, in a highly polarized political environment, we expect people, if they know who a politician is, to be able to say, I have a positive or negative view about them. So that's one way to kind of figure out what name ideas is just to see who can express a positive or negative view about this person. But in this case, when you've got 23, sort of named potential Democratic candidates, we know just because of, we do this for a living. Because we know that a lot of people aren't going to have any opinions about, a large number of the candidates. So we just basically ask, hey, have you heard of these people? And the thing that we find is that, not surprisingly, 82% of registered voters say that they've heard of Joe Biden. 82% say that they've heard of Beto O'Rourke because, of course, he just ran a pretty well-publicized Senate campaign here. But only 8 of the 23 candidates we tested had higher than 50% name recognition.
So unless we get accused of cutting out and Bernie Sanders had 81. So
right, sorry.
For the Sanders fans among you out there, we are not selling Bernie Sanders short.
Well, honestly, and let's sort of want to surprise people in the poll in some ways, but this is actually going on in national polling. Elizabeth Warren had 74% approval. So there's definitely, or not approval, name identification.
Right.
But the main point here is, out of 23 potential candidates we tested, 15 of them, more than half of the electorate, just was like, I don't know who that is. I've never heard of them. And so that's where someone like Joe Biden really benefits in a lot of these things, in a lot of these early polls, because when you go and then say, okay, you're doing a political poll. So who, you obviously are interested in politics. You probably answered some questions for me. Hey, so who are you going to vote for out of these 23 people?
You've already identified as a Democrat.
Right. You've already identified as a Democrat. Well, for a lot of people, you're just looking for some way to make a decision at this point. And that's most often going to be, well, I know who this person is, and I don't know who the other 22 people are. Or I know a lot more about Joe Biden than I do about, Bill de Blasio.
And now that we told you about the how and the why, the what here is that Biden had topped the list with 23%, and this was just among voters who said that they would vote. They planned on voting in the Democratic primary. Biden had 23%, Beto O'Rourke had 15%, Elizabeth Warren had 14%, Bernie Sanders had 12%. Another guy's really kind of having a moment, I think, nationally, and with these the Democratic debates, primary debates coming up, has a lot on the line. Pete Buttigieg had 8%, Kamala Harris 5%. And then, by way of transition, the other Texan, prominent, at least legit Texan on the ballot, Julian Castro only had 3%. And we'll pause there and note that Julian Castro has been somebody who has gotten a lot of attention from Democratic elites in the course of his career. He was the mayor of San Antonio. He was the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development during the Obama administration. I think we talked about him a little bit last week.
He was the keynote speaker at the 2012 Democratic National Convention.
I mean, he's been heralded as the next big thing from Texas for over a decade now. And these are, frankly, not next big thing numbers.
Right. So he came in at only 3%, in the Texas polling, which is, not really far off from where he's been in national polling. But obviously his home base is supposed to be in Texas, again, as you mentioned. I mean, he's the mayor of San Antonio. People should know, at least hear more than anywhere else, who he is. But what we did is theoretically. But what we did here was, like I was just talking about, we actually asked sort of these favorability items. Do you have a favorable or unfavorable opinion of, for both Beto O'Rourke and Julian Castro? And we chose them because they're obviously sort of the two Texas-based politicians in the presidential election, and we wanted to see where they were. And the thing is we've asked these before, and that allows us to see, whether either of these candidates are gaining or losing ground, both overall and with subsets of voters. And the thing that's sort of notable about Castro is we asked people what they thought of him back in February. And, we then take the 4 months between then and June, and his numbers have not changed at all. So, I mean, not to be too harsh here, but it's hard to look at these numbers, and especially in a state where
he's... That means you're about to be harsh.
Yeah, no, it's like no offense, but I mean, basically, it's not clear that any of the campaigning that he's done over the last 4 months has done anything to really raise his profile, at least among Texas voters.
Yeah, and I think that, the contrast here with O'Rourke, although Beto O'Rourke has his own problems here, is notable in that Beto O'Rourke's numbers have not moved very much either, and to the extent that they have, he's eroded a little bit, within the statistical margin among Democrats. But O'Rourke's numbers are also amazingly, static in the same way that Julian Castro's are. Though O'Rourke still enjoys a little bit of a Texas premium here in the sense that he ran about 10 to 12 points higher in his home state than he's running nationally and in most other states. The problem for O'Rourke and for Castro is that, at least among insiders and certainly in their appeals to donors to their campaign, part of the argument is we're from Texas. If we can put Texas in play, this is in the presidential general election as the Democratic candidate, this is a huge asset. Texas is a huge chunk of electoral votes in the Electoral College. If somehow Texas is seen as very competitive, or at least competitive enough at the national level in the presidential race, that the Republican Party and the Republican candidate, President Trump, have to put resources in Texas, it's a huge benefit for the Democratic ticket, and it's part of the argument. This is not helping. These numbers like this are not helping their argument at all. And in fact, I suspect, we got these numbers. There was another poll in Texas a couple of weeks ago by Northeastern University that also got, pretty similar numbers, showed neither of them really tearing things up. And it's a problem for their campaigns, even though it's early. It's not fatal, but, a strong poll for either one of them would have been a real shot in the arm.
Yeah, and I think what you can see here, one of the interesting sort of, I would call this a pretty nuanced and storyline for those of us paying really close attention is when O'Rourke entered the race, I think one of the questions that sort of emerged after he entered was like, well, what kind of candidate is O'Rourke? And what I mean by this is, and Jim and I have talked about a lot how this metaphor is significantly overused when people talk about the lanes in the primary, whether you're sort of someone who is looking for the most progressive, and we're just talking about the Democratic primary right now. This is true in the Republican primary too in different ways, but are you just looking for the most progressive voters? Are you looking to be the person to pick up the moderate votes? There's definitely a lane for, the people would argue, for African-American candidates looking for African-American votes, but really also for everybody, in a lot of cases. And the thing about O'Rourke was sort of like, where does he fit in this? And one of the things was in Texas, he seemed almost, that campaign against Cruz, he was portrayed as basically the next coming of socialism, which is not uncommon, but the idea was that he was this extremely left-leaning candidate.
Right.
When he jumped to the national stage, there was a lot of attention to the fact like, well, maybe Beto's not as liberal as we thought, and some of this had to do with some, probably pretty Texas-specific votes he talked about having to do with offshore oil drilling and things like that. But also a look at his record kind of indicated, well, he's liberal in the sense that he's a Democrat, but he's not so liberal.
Yeah, he's definitely left of center, and so that became part of this conversation.
And that's become part of this conversation. But what you see in these numbers in our fave-unfave ratings, and even if you look across where his support is potentially in the Democratic primary, it's striking these numbers that he looks a lot more like Joe Biden than like Bernie Sanders.
In terms of the politics of the people that are supporting him.
Right. And what we saw was in fave-unfave numbers, and I always say this, is that, you can take a really popular candidate and then you throw them into a presidential primary and you're forced to differentiate yourself. Beto O'Rourke running against Ted Cruz is different than Beto O'Rourke running against Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and Joe Biden. And so what you see from the last poll to this is you see a drop in his approval ratings among liberals by 10 points. Not a huge drop, but basically, while his overall numbers stayed even, it masked sort of under the surface, a pretty good uptick in the view of him among independent voters, but also a pretty big drop in the views of him among liberals.
Right.
And that's sort of, how you're seeing the mechanics of the primary process and this sort of playing out in actual views.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's to step back and to notice about that is that this is not new. Part of it is simply contextual in the sense that Beto O'Rourke is going to look different by contrast running against Ted Cruz than he is running against an array of candidates across the spectrum from the more or less far left to the center left in the Democratic primary. But the other thing for those, for people thinking about Texas is that this happens, in general, and that somebody that looks pretty liberal in Texas in a national context as a Democrat, the center of the Democratic Party in Texas has moved somewhat to the left over time, but it's still to the, more toward the center than the center of the Democratic Party nationally. So all things being equal, you take somebody who looks pretty liberal, pretty lefty in Texas, and you put him in the national context, and there's going to be a lot more candidates and a lot more discourse on the left because of the differences in the political culture in Texas versus the overall country. Texas, as much as it's becoming more urban, as much as it's becoming more competitive, is still to the right of the center of the rest of the country. Certainly the Northeast.
Yeah,
but even overall.
Yeah,
Democratic Party overall nationally.
Yeah, there's still no support here for like a statewide income tax to fund broad-based social programs or anything like that, and even among Democrats.
Right.
So there's just that's just not the case. So, I mean, why don't we then, think about how John Cornyn's doing?
Yeah, I was going to say, talking about
Texas.
O'Rourke does move us back in this discussion about the comparisons. That's where I was going, was to put us now a little bit back in the state. This poll is pretty good news for, John Cornyn's had some good news generally. It's not all good news for John Cornyn, but, the incumbent U.S. Senator John Cornyn, who is running for re-election in 2020, there was an extended discussion that I think we've already referenced here about whether Beto O'Rourke should run against Cornyn for the Senate seat in Texas, having just built a base and a toolkit and a bunch of voters and experience in Texas. Should he have run against John Cornyn and challenged John Cornyn right away for the U.S. Senate seat? He chose to run for president. He's having the experience we're talking about. That's turned out to be pretty good for John Cornyn, and and it's good for him, not just that he seems to have a clearer field, but that he still also is showing comparative weakness compared to the most successful and well-known Republicans in the state.
Yeah, part of the argument against O'Rourke running for Senate here in Texas again was two things. The positive argument is basically to say, when you get the opportunity to run for president and people think you should, usually you take it. Especially if you think the environment favors your party. And that's how. Look, whether you agree with that or not, I think that's the argument that that won the day here, which is to say that O'Rourke raised $80 million, was basically thrust onto the national stage, et cetera, et cetera. And again, we don't agree with that argument. And you can read.
But one can see it.
But one can see it. The other argument that people were in the negative case was to say, well, Cruz is so particularly disliked amongst Democrats that running against him is just different. It's not the same thing. John Cornyn is a much, I would never call him a moderate Republican. I don't think he'd want anyone to call him that per se. But, he's he's a Republican in
the pre-Tea Party mold.
Yeah, he's a pre-Tea Party mold Republican, senator. So he's much more involved I would say, he's involved in the leadership team in the Republican Party in the Senate, is much more of a in the U.S. Senate, probably much more of a deal maker, that kind of thing. But that's also hurt him over time, where we've always seen that his numbers were never as strong as Ted Cruz's or even Greg Abbott's, and some of the other people that you consider to be at his level. But in this poll, we actually saw an uptick for him. We saw that his approval rating overall went up to 42%, which is pretty high. For him, it's pretty
Cornyn.
For Cornyn, it's comparable with his numbers: 42 approve, 39 disapprove, 29 with no opinion is pretty close to comparable to Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick. But the other side is say Dan Patrick just escaped a pretty close election, and sort of most importantly, the big change that sort of really increased Cornyn's name ID here. So people who could actually make a positive or negative assessment of him. It's really mostly among Democrats. Among Republicans, 68% approve of the job he's doing, 13% disapprove. Again, that's, pretty close to where I'd say Dan Patrick is, among Republicans.
The Lieutenant Governor.
But among Democrats, the share who had a negative opinion of him went up 10 points since the last poll in February, from 60% to 70%. And what's kind of notable, to me in all this is Cornyn's always been kind of a little bit below the radar.
Right.
I don't think that's the case anymore. No matter what, he looks, he's as negatively viewed amongst Democrats, within a couple points as Ted Cruz has been. And so I don't think that, from the perspective that Cornyn is just such a different candidate for Democrats to run against in this environment at this point, and based on the data we see, I don't think that's the case anymore.
Yeah, it's not. And that underlines, again, that, O'Rourke might have been in a better position than they thought to run against Cornyn. And just to put a little meat on those bones, when we talk about Cornyn doing relatively better, his approval rating was, as low as 27% positive, 39% negative overall as recently as 1 year ago. And so now if you fast forward to where we are now, 1 year later, he's 42% positive, 39% negative. As you say, more people have an opinion of him, but it's a better position to be in. And I do think that the Cornyn campaign and Cornyn himself have done this on purpose. They have raised his visibility as they've seen the chances of a more competitive race increase over the last year, and certainly in the wake of 2018. So, if you look at Cornyn's position, that race looks to be probably closer than they would like, depending on who the Democrats agree upon as a candidate. But now, and there's still rumbling. I mean, I had a conversation late last night with a political reporter about the possibility of, not just gaming out. So say Beto O'Rourke goes into this weekend's debate or next weekend's Democratic debate. He's on the less crowded stage. He's not on the stage with Biden, I don't think, with the front runners. And he doesn't do anything, and he continues buried. Well, being buried in kind of the second tier at best of Democratic candidates, maybe lower if somebody else does well in that debate. Does he come back and decide he is going to run for Senate? How viable is he? How damaged is he?
Yeah. You could say the same thing about Castro, too. I mean, it seems less likely that Julian Castro would drop out of the president's race and run for that Senate seat. But I mean, he's in a similar position. I mean, for both of them, it would be I don't want to say it would be a challenge, but I mean, since there is already there's already more than one named Democratic candidate interested in challenging Cornyn, the most prominent of which is MJ Hager, who ran an unsuccessful congressional race, but a close one against John Carter of Round Rock in the last cycle. And she raised a lot of money and got a lot of, sort of viral attention for some ads that she did. The idea of, one of Texas's two sort of most known male Democratic candidates putting their foot in the presidential waters and then coming back into that Texas race
to knock out a rising woman in the party who's more or less well liked and appreciated. It's a little rough.
Yeah, it might be a little bit rough.
This is a rough game, though.
Yeah, that's true. Fair enough.
And it would be unwise, but I would also say that they haven't made a raft of wise decisions thus far.
Yeah, I was gonna say if you could see Jim and I right now, we're shrugging shoulders with.
Yeah, I think we're edging into snark. So we'll move. Yeah, we'll move on to one last topic here quickly, which is we also had job approval numbers for the state leadership, including the Texas legislature, and we've talked in the previous weeks about the state leadership, particularly Governor Abbott and the legislature's efforts to provide kind of a fallback strategy and to shore up their position in the midst of all these national politics and the churn that we're talking about. And, we can talk about this more as we go on, but because we're going to run out of time. But, Gov, this was a good poll for Governor Abbott honestly, of almost everybody here, this was probably best for Governor Abbott in terms of individuals whose political situations we touched on. Governor Abbott's approval ratings were as high as we've seen them since he's been governor. 54% overall approval, only 32% disapprove, 14% opting out, including 85% job approval rating among Republicans, which is in the middle of the band he's been in for a while. The Texas legislature had a 43% positive job rating and a 33% negative job rating, which is about where they were at the end of the 2015 session, but about 10 points more positive than they were at the end of the 2017 session, which we referenced in the podcast before as kind of a rough session for the legislature in terms of public reception and what they actually got accomplished. So as you come out of this, it looks like the strategy that we've talked about in here, in which the legislature tried to give people what they wanted, quote unquote, and provide bread and butter things by increasing funding for public education and at least taking some arguably, but still pretty concrete steps toward at least lowering the rate of increase of property taxes in the future moving forward, seems to have served them pretty well.
Yeah, I mean, I think the interesting thing in both Abbott's approval numbers and in the approval numbers of the text ledge is the fact that, overall for both groups, or for both Abbott and the Texas legislature, Republican approval remained basically static. And what I mean static is here, Abbott's approval remains pretty static among Republicans looking back over the last number of number of polls, because we ask every poll. When we look at the Texas legislature compared to the end of the last two sessions, again, the sort of, approval among Republicans and also among conservatives looks pretty pretty consistent, or at least within, a pretty narrow range of, variability. Where you're seeing the increase, honestly, is among Democrats.
And independents.
So, Jim mentioned, Abbott's approval numbers. I mean, what puts Abbott at 54-32 overall to some degree is the fact that you have almost 20% of Democrats who approve of the job that Abbott's doing. And while that's a little high, there's usually about somewhere between 10 and 20% of Democrats who approve. Compared to the end of the last session, often referred to as sort of the bathroom bill session, only 8% of Democrats approved of the legislature's job performance. And this time it's up to 22, so it's up 16 points. That's 14 points. So that's, that's where you're seeing, and that's actually, as we've been talking about the framing of the legislative session, this is where there's going to be some conflict, especially within the intra-party primaries going forward. Is, did the legislative leadership and also the members move too far or react too strongly to 2017 and then the 2018 elections, and then do things that Democrats appreciated but not Republicans? There's a case to be made for that, although there's also a case to be made against that because Republicans look equally happy.
Yeah, I mean, I think that case is actually not very strong at this moment in terms of, Republican, groups that are, well, I should put it this way, conservative groups that are claiming to speak for Republican voters, saying that somehow the legislature betrayed them. I see zero evidence of that in these numbers. I mean, not skimpy evidence, zero, particularly in the legislative approval numbers, because Abbott's numbers went up a little among those groups, but they went up appreciably in terms of people's assessment of the legislature. And for legislators, that are all, remember, Abbott's not going to be on the ballot in 2020. Most of these legislators all of the House members and, a big bunch of the senators. And so the legislative approval numbers are particularly good news for them as well. I kind of put Abbott at the top of that heap because Abbott remains the figurehead of the party. But it's also very good news if you're a Texas legislator running for re-election. So next week, we'll have a still as yet undetermined guest. I'll be out of the loop. Josh will be in control. Maybe he'll just take control and you'll never hear from me again. I don't know. Maybe I'll go off and not come back. In one way or the other.
Director, one way or another.
So enjoy the week. Go see poll results as they roll out in the Texas Tribune. And Josh and somebody will be back next week. The Second Reading Podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.